Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to World Travel Market London 2016. My name is Simon Press, and I'm the Senior Exhibition Director for WTM London, and I'm delighted to be introducing today's session and be welcoming two of the world's leading airline bosses to the travel industry's leading global event. Sir Tim Clark is the visionary behind Emirates' vastly impressive growth and development over the last 30 years. Joining as part of the management team which launched the airline after stints at British Caledonian and Gulf Air, Sir Tim is president of the airline, which has achieved 28 consecutive years of profit. Willie Walsh, the CEO of IAG, which includes British Airways and Iberia, just like Sir Tim, has a long, successful and profitable track record in the aviation industry, with roles at Aer Lingus and Virgin Atlantic before joining BA and forming IAG.
Virgin Atlantic.
Not Virgin Atlantic. You were never
Atlantic.
there. My sincere apologies. It's highly respected and listened to, not only in the airline businesses, but the wider travel industry and by the world's governments. There is so much going on in the aviation industry at present, with the UK government's consultation to add a third runway at Heathrow and the impact of Brexit on the industry itself. I'm sure, like me, you're absolutely fascinated to hear the opinions of these aviation industry stalwarts. I shall now hand over to WTM London aviation expert John Strickland for more considered introductions. John has worked in the aviation industry for more than 30 years at airlines. Now, am I going to get this right, John? At airlines including British Airways, British Caledonian, and Buzz.
That's right.
Yeah?
That's correct.
Ah, right, good.
Not Virgin Atlantic.
Not Virgin Atlantic. He now runs JLS Consulting and has been WTM London's aviation expert for 10 years. I hope you all have a thought-provoking session. John.
Simon, thanks very much. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this year's aviation session at the WTM. As Simon said, we've got two great airline leaders here with us today. I've got a lot of personal admiration for both of them. And I said I'd say some warm words about them in introduction, which I hope is correct. And Tim, I was going to describe you as a real airline planner. It's in your blood right from the beginning. Anything that you want to know about airline network planning, deciding what routes should be flown, but Tim doesn't know, you could write on the back of a microchip. Tim's been a network planner, man and boy, and I would think it's fair to say you still love that today among all the other responsibilities you have to deal with. So welcome, Sir Tim. Willie, I was going to say, you're a former pilot. Something you found got a bit boring after a while, and you had to get out of that, flying 737s back and forth across the Irish Sea. Moved, unusually for a pilot, I would say, successfully into airline management, because it's not a very common thing. I can think of one other successful airline boss who made that span across the divide. There are many pilots who think they can manage an airline, but Willie's actually done it several times over, and he's now leading the group IAG, which is a group, some of you may not know who IAG is. Its full name is International Consolidated Airline Group, but that wouldn't really worry the group, because the airlines that are the constituent members, British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus and Vueling, are well-known brands and successful in their own right. So, Willie, welcome to the WTM today. Tim, Emirates, of course, has risen to be one of the leading airlines in the world from the days when you had, I think, a couple of long-haul aircraft in the beginning to today when you've got over 250 aircraft. So, again, welcome to both of you. I think if we start off, gentlemen, with just a quick look at each of your airline business models, because you're both successful leaders of successful airlines, but the models are different. I mentioned, Tim, that Emirates began, certainly when it moved into long-haul flying, with a couple of aircraft, and today you're a global player out of Dubai. But one thing you have done in particular is to grow organically. You've grown by your own means, largely speaking. Perhaps the only real change to that in recent times is you established a big partnership with Qantas. So tell us, Tim, is that still going to be your philosophy to carry on this organic growth? And tell us a bit about this, I suppose, groundbreaking partnership you established only 3 or 4 years back with Qantas.
Well, you're right. We are an organic animal. We have always felt, given the business model that we've employed ever since we started, and given the scalability of the business model, it's essentially, as you rightly said, a long-haul network carrier business model which sought to globalize and scale up over the period of the time that we've been operating, 30 years. The notion that we would have entered into any kind of M&A or alliance arrangement would have been good for some, not for everybody, but as far as we were concerned, we needed to have direct control over exactly what we wanted to do, when we wanted to do it, and where we wanted to do it. So that's the reason we've stayed fairly true to the business model, which doesn't see any kind of, in the future, any form of M&A. But of course, that could post-date me, and things could change after that. You could never say never. As far as the Qantas relationship is concerned, this is a very robust commercial relationship where the core of the Qantas activity in Europe, after BA and Qantas sort of separated on the joint services agreement, basically Emirates took everything west of Australia, Middle East, Europe, etc., with a heavily coded arrangement with Qantas, and that allowed Alan and the team down there to switch his capacity where the opportunity cost of the north-south axis Transpac was better suited for what he was doing. So actually it's worked very well. We've had interesting times in terms of trying to mesh all that, but then these things are... But this isn't an equity stake. This is purely a commercial arrangement. That's the key thing. It's a
commercial arrangement, isn't it?
It's a commercial arrangement which suits both parties at the moment very well and allows us to concentrate on the things that we do best geographically. And we have spliced together something that I think has real value.
Now, that's quite different to what some of your peer group airlines in the Gulf have done. I'm thinking particularly of Etihad, which has invested, for example, even in the Australian market, they've invested in Virgin Australia. You still would say, for you, this approach is better than actually investing cash in another business or having a cross-shareholding of some sort?
In my opinion, in our opinion, that is the way to go. Others will do things differently. I guess, as you said at the beginning, I'm a network planner. I'm fairly much of a centrist, and I like to keep sort of hands on everything. I don't like the idea or relish the idea of an M&A situation where you've got contra-rotating agendas which may eclipse and occlude your business model, going back to the point I made earlier. Others have a different way of doing it, and actually they're very successful. I mean, look at Willie, what Willie's done with IAG. That has worked particularly well. But for us, at the moment, it's a focus on the growth that we've achieved over the last 31 years, and we're going to continue doing that.
Thanks, Tim. And Willie, as Tim said, what you've done in IAG is different to what he's done, but I think different to what many other airlines have done too. It's not simply a matter of buying into other airlines. I mean, IAG was set up as an entity, wasn't it, of which it has constituent members. Can you tell us a bit about your philosophy and how that has worked? 5 years in, isn't it now?
Well, we recognise that there is value that can be created through consolidation, but equally, if you look at the experience of the industry historically, there's been a lot of value destroyed through consolidation. And what we recognised was that we had a very strong brand in British Airways. Our ability to grow that organically was limited, principally because of capacity availability at Heathrow. So with limited growth availability, there wasn't so much that we could do. But looking at the mistakes that others had made, we figured that by creating IAG, we could keep the best of the individual brands while extracting value by centralizing what could be done. So, it was very much the case of investing in the brands that we had where those brands had value. Where brands don't have value, so BMI would be an example of that, integrate that into one of the businesses and use that in effect to facilitate organic growth. So I think it's the answer that works for us. I do look with envy at what Tim has achieved, and I think when you consider where Emirates has come from and the pace at which it has grown and the way Dubai has developed into a truly global hub, the busiest international hub airport in the world now, I think you do have to recognize that that is something exceptional. And, the vision of the airline and the airport and the region, the government, is something that really does need to be admired.
And in fact, just touching on that point, I mean, you actually have had in BA in IAG a positive relationship with one of Tim's colleagues, Qatar Airways, led by Akbar Abaka. Indeed, they've become a shareholder. So you actually see a way, in the way that Qantas is working commercially with Emirates, you've seen a way to work with one of the other Gulf carriers.
Yeah, and Tim will acknowledge this. The separation between British Airways and Qantas was amicable, and we recognise.
When Tim stepped
no,
in.
absolutely not.
Predated that.
Yeah, we recognise that what we could extract in terms of value from that joint business was very limited, and it wasn't going to answer the challenges that Alan faced at Qantas. So it was clear to us that that Alan Qantas needed to do something different, and I think unlike some of my competitors in Europe, I recognise what the Gulf carriers have done. I'm envious as to how the governments in the region value the economic contribution that the airlines make, and I keep pointing to the fact that in Europe we don't recognise that, we take it for granted. I think we had reached the limit of possibilities with Qantas, and it was a very friendly separation where we decided that it was right for both of us to go and do our own thing.
And actually, the kangaroo route, the UK or Europe, Australia route is it's always been a competitive route. In the past, it was more Asian carriers, be it Cathay Pacific or one of the other carriers, Singapore Airlines, for example, in that region. You've got a massive output on that route throughout Europe with Qantas, Tim. You, on the other hand, have gone down to effectively, it's one flight a day, but is there a way to step back into that market a bit more now with the relationship with Qatar, because they're developing quite a lot in that part of the world?
Yeah, without question there is. Using Doha as a hub, and you've got quite a number of options available to Australia now. So, historically, we did it over Hong Kong and over Singapore. That option is still available to us. You've got Kuala Lumpur, but you've got the Middle East hubs now, Dubai being the preeminent one, but Qatar at Doha developing a bigger network into Australia. So I think the interesting thing for us is, we always were challenged by the profitability of the kangaroo route. And since we separated from Qantas, in fact, we've never been more profitable on that route. So I think it is a route that sees very significant competition, but it can work, but you've got to have the right cost structure in place, the right commercial structure in place. And we didn't quite have that when we were in partnership with Qantas. We do now, but there is certainly an opportunity for us to develop that partnership with Qatar.
Okay. And Tim, we've talked about Emirates being standalone. I mean, you have is it a management contract with Angola Airlines? There's a fairly modest involvement. That's not a big investment you're making, is it? And it's not going to be the precursor of big new investments to come.
No, our friends in the Angolan government basically asked us to help them out.
Right.
And so we put a team of people down there who I believe have been helping them out very successfully, and certainly done quite a lot of good work, mainly on the operations and logistics side of the company. So that's something that is arm's length to what we do.
And you do have many code shares, a fairly conventional kind of code shares and ticket prorate agreements with many airlines to extend your network around the world. What about alliances? This is something I'm raising this specifically because, and I see the smile immediately come to your face, Tim. Emirates has never really believed in alliances. And then, Willie, you're in an alliance, but I want to ask you, do you still believe that alliances don't really have a big value? And Willie, do you see alliances as going down in importance as these different kind of ventures come up? Tim?
Well, I would never say the alliances don't have value. For the constituent part of the alliances, the airlines that are in them, they obviously do value the alliance. Going back to the point I made earlier about predetermining what we wanted to do when we wanted to do it, had we been part of an alliance in our formative years, it would have probably diluted and taken us a little bit off course in the way we wanted to go. Do I think alliances have a place today? Yes, I think so. But the sort of bedrock of the thinking of the alliance concept has been challenged in the last few years, not by necessarily the likes of us, although we have been, in terms of a challenge to the whole way that the international airline business is run. But you've seen the migration since the alliances came through of the low-cost budget phenomenon from the US into Europe and into Asia, and that has transformed everything. So To me, they are a tad anachronistic. We're moving into a B2C age now where technology just drives just about everything we do. And how that figures and how that will figure in the alliance structure in the next 5 or 10 years is, in my view, questionable. Will they survive? I think they may do, but they'll take a different format. And I think there will be, where, as Willie says, there is perceived value, where like-minded airlines on the B2C kick understand where value can be created. It'll take them out of the alliance model. So it'll morph into something else, but I don't think it'll be probably along the lines. Remember, these were constructed in the early 80s, and as you know, they came from equity swaps read by SAS and all the bits and pieces, deregulation coming along in the late 70s and all in the US. So they were a sort of a metamorphosis of the way things were going and the challenges that airlines faced, and they felt safer if they were together and they could perhaps get their global aspirations by doing something. This was 70s and 80s, think, in my view. It will change in the next 5 or 10 years.
Willie, do you share that view?
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with anything Tim said. I think alliances have had value. They do have value today, but I think you've got to question whether they will continue to have value in the future. And I think the relationships have changed. You see more and more the development of joint ventures, probably grown out of some of the alliance relationships. But if you go back to my time at Aer Lingus, I didn't actually take Aer Lingus out of the One World Alliance, but I did prepare the groundwork for Aer Lingus to come out. Because what you've got to recognize is that there is a cost of being associated or a member of an alliance. And for a small airline, that cost can be very close, if not at times greater than the revenue benefit, the commercial benefit that you'll get. And in the case of Aer Lingus, it was getting very close to that when I left, because the Aer Lingus business model had changed. Mm-hmm. So Tim's absolutely right. I think there was a need, I would argue, for alliances for certain airlines, British Airways being one of them. I think there still is a role for the alliances to play, but like Tim, I would question whether. I'd be surprised if they exist 20 years from now, and I would question whether they would exist 10 years from now. But they'll be around for a few years to come.
Okay, and Tim, you alluded to changes in airline business models. I wanted to ask you both. One of the flavour of the month airline business models that's talked about more and more is long-haul low cost. I mean, it's accepted, I think, that short-haul low cost works. It's in pretty well every part of the world. Lots of examples of success. And I do remember asking you once, Tim, and I think you told me you'd done an exercise a few years ago in a different fuel environment, and it took very specific conditions for long-haul low cost to work. Do you still think that is the case?
I think long-haul low cost is we are just on the brink of something fairly new coming along. Although, well, you're right, I did write extensively on it in the late 90s about how long-haul low cost was going to be something that would be within the next 10 years. Well, I got that wrong, like most economists. However, the fact is now you're seeing Scoot, you're seeing Norwegian, you're seeing Tony Fernandez and AirAsia X. And I think once these have sorted themselves out in terms of the way they're going to operate, the business model, I think we are beginning to see the beginnings of an inflection point. And I would have said that with more gusto had I not been concerned about what's happening with regard to the global era politics as a result of, we know what's going on in Europe and what is likely to happen tomorrow in the US, as we see a contraction, a move away from liberalism and the multilateral trading activities and the beginnings of these fortresses starting to appear, and that'll kill a lot of this debt. So if you get back into an aeropolitical framework which is fairly predetermined in its thinking, then the likes of long-haul low cost will fail because they won't get the access that they need. But believe me, with the pricing model I looked at, the price points that I looked at all those years ago, using an A380, believe it or not, 850 seats, and an A340 600, it seemed to me that this was something that once you get into the incipient demand that will be tapped with these kind of price points, then it would suddenly explode. So will that happen? It's part of the point I mentioned about alliances where the business models are changing. We've seen low cost, short haul, medium, now we're seeing long haul, low cost. I think that's where we'll see things coming along quite a lot differently in the next 5 years.
Willie, I mean, you're cheek by jowl, at least at Gatwick. You've got Norwegian now established with a long-haul base, seemingly delivering very good load factors. I know less about the revenues. And BA, it seems, is reacting in its own chosen way as part of IAG. You've announced some new air routes, and I think you just last week announced you're going to densify some of your 777 aircraft. Is that what you think for you is the right response?
Well, it is for British Airways. But, let me answer your question. Will long-haul, low-cost work? I believe it will.
Right.
But you need to define what success looks like. And I think success will be, a long-haul, low-cost airline that exceeds its cost of capital on a, sustainable basis. There will be lots of airlines who will label themselves long-haul, low-cost and will never make a penny, in the same way as there were lots of short-haul, low-cost airlines who never made a penny. So the label means nothing. And the success, I measure success by profitability, by return. What you would have to say is today, there are very few who have proven that it works today. I would point to Aer Lingus and argue that it does work, because I think Aer Lingus is the question is it long haul? I probably can't argue that Aer Lingus is long haul. It's more
because
medium
it's
haul.
Shorter.
Yeah, it's a relatively short stage length. But what Aer Lingus does on the transatlantic, it is the lowest cost producer of transatlantic flying, and it is very profitable. Norwegian, I think, is a good airline. I like what Bjorn has done. I have great admiration for him. I think he's yet to crack the profitability bit. The margins are improving. He's generating cash. But, what you see there is a model that, and going to what Tim said, and I think this is very important, it does depend on a liberal regime to be able to access destinations that will be able to maximize the utilization of the aircraft, and it does require feed. And it's a challenging environment to get all of the pieces right, but I believe it will work. And I think what Norwegian has demonstrated, and more you're seeing, is that the consumer is prepared to look at unbundling the product in a way that the consumer on short haul has accepted that. And these were issues that we always questioned. Would people be prepared to pay for a meal on a long-haul flight? Or would they automatically assume that came as a standard? Would they be prepared to pay to check in a bag? And it's clear from what Norwegian has demonstrated that the consumer is prepared to do that. So I believe it will work. I believe it's certainly much more difficult to make it work than on short haul. But there's reason to believe that in certain areas you can see a model that will be effective.
I think it's interesting that Michael O'Leary, who has proven the success of his short-haul low-cost model, and has, even if it's not in Ryanair, he has a personal ambition. He would love to run a long-haul low-cost, but he's held back, saying that he can't get the aircraft at the right price at the moment. So it's one thing to have an efficient plane, like a 787 or 350, but if it's expensive in capital terms, you may blow the model. Yeah,
but I think it is interesting that what Michael's moved away from Ryanair doing it to, and you're right, I think he has a personal ambition to see it
rather
work.
Than
and
company
I've no doubt that given what Michael has achieved, if he wants to do that, he could make a success of it. But it's fundamentally different to the Ryanair model today. And moving, if you were a shareholder in Ryanair and you looked at Ryanair moving into long haul, you would have to question whether that's the right use or the best use of shareholders' money.
We could talk more about that, but time is probably not going to permit us. So let's move on to the challenges of this year. We're, 11 months through. I had down on my list to ask you the question, has it been a difficult year? But I think I would ask it quite that way. Tim, is this amongst the most difficult you've seen in the time at the helm at Emirates, or is it just like any other? Because I think you, of all people, have often said it's the nature of the industry. There are these massive ups and downs, and you have to build it into your planning and thinking.
Well, you do. And I have to be quite honest, this has been a tough year. And for the reasons that everybody in the audience will know, we've got so many geopolitical events, socioeconomic events, natural disasters, call it what you like. And when you're in the business as we are, which is a global operation on a long-haul network basis, every time there's a knock, whether it be in the economic sphere or the geopolitical sphere, it takes its toll. But this year, you've seen a kind of triple, quadruple whammy of all of this. And we've seen demand fall off as the GDPs have gone down globally, regionally, and by country. Africa has slowed down. The South American markets have slowed down. We've had all the problems in the summer with, of course, the terrorist activity, which has affected Asian demand going into Europe during the course of this summer. And we've had within Europe our own issues, whether that be, dare I say it, that favourite word, Brexit, whether it's the concern about what's going to happen next year in Europe when you've got a Dutch, German, and French elections coming up, what's going to happen in Italy with the Prime Minister there trying to change out things in December. There's a lot going, of course. Tomorrow will be an interesting day. Wednesday will be an interesting day. And of course, all this is hugely interesting, but one thing's for sure, it suppresses demand. It suppresses investor confidence, and through that, the economies are all sort of ticking over. Some are going better than others, but when you read about growth rates of 0.8% or 1.4%, and if you're lucky, these are the kind of things that you've got to deal with in the future. But remember, we were talking about 16% in China. We were talking about the Vietnamese economy, the Thai economies, the Malaysian economies, all moving ahead at a great pace. Now you've seen the flat lining of that. So we have to deal with that. What has that done? Reduced demand into plane. It has also suppressed the yields because there is a lot of capacity out there, and I think the airline world has been busy trying to deal with that. I've got to be careful what I say here, otherwise you'll be accused of trying to send messages, but I'm not. I'm simply saying that and Emirates faces exactly the kind of headwinds that everybody else faces. Patchy in places, some better than others, some are coming on strong, but generally not one of our better years.
Willie, I guess similar. IAG's issued a profit warning, but still producing very solid results, having said that.
Yeah, it's been a tough year for all the reasons Tim said, but it will be a record year for us. And we issued a profit warning immediately after the vote on the 23rd of June. And the reason for that was very simple. We report our results in euro, but we have a significant sterling revenue and profit base. And when we translate that profit into euro, it's going to be translated at a much lower rate of exchange. So we had anticipated that a vote to leave the EU would see the collapse in the value of the pound against the dollar and the euro, and that's what's happened. So it was, if you like, a technical issue. But yeah, it's been a tough year. I think there have been some areas of positive development, but Tim has outlined a long list of things that have challenged us through the year. The beauty of this industry, though, is we're getting better. I think much, much better in the way we respond to these challenges. If you had looked at that list and applied that to an industry 10 years ago, well, I think you'd see an industry in really bad shape today. But I think we're getting better at responding. Somebody said we've had more experience than most other industries of responding to these issues. And I think that points to an industry that is more robust. And going forward, I think will be better still.
Well, is that true for all airlines in the industry? Because again, if I look at your peer group, I mean, IAG, you're going to produce, in absolute terms, improved results year on year. But we look in Europe and we see Lufthansa still battling on, and Air France KLM in particular battling on. Are they not taking lessons out of the IAG book in terms of tackling the cost issue and getting into robust shape in the way that you are seemingly doing? And I see you smiling there, Willie.
Air France KLM, no. It's it's sad when you look at it. They've done nothing. And to be fair, it's not because they didn't try. They did try, but for various reasons they have been unable, because the organisation is unwilling to face up to the fact that maybe Air France, and it's predominantly Air France, but maybe there won't be a future for Air France in an environment where it doesn't adapt. But it hasn't adapted, and it's relied on the French government standing behind it, and the people that are in Air France hope that if worse comes to worse, the French government will step in and rescue them. And when you have that sort of dynamic in the industry, as we've seen in the past, then people won't change, and not only will they not change, but they'll resist change. But what we've been able to demonstrate is that governments in Europe don't have a role to play anymore. There's plenty of opportunity for commercially owned and commercially run. And what you have in Tim's case is a commercially run airline. That's the reason I've always been an admirer of what they have done in the Gulf. It is run on commercial lines. It doesn't matter who owns you if you run the business on commercial lines. But if you're being run on political lines and being owned politically, well then you're not going to adjust to these changes. But the industry as a whole, I think the industry is better. Yes, there are some within the industry who still live in a bygone age, and quite honestly, I think that the day will come, the day of reckoning will come. It's been a long way waiting, but I think it will come for some of these airlines.
Because I've often wondered if there's, when IAG was formed, it was BA and Iberia, and many people said, oh, well, it should never have been done, why have they ended up with Iberia? But there's been a massive transformation, and maybe I'm being too simplistic, but if we look at Latin-type culture in France and Spain, other national characteristics which are similar, which mean that Air France should be able to do what's happening in Iberia. Does Iberia prove it could be done if the will was there?
Yeah, but I think in France you still have the French government intervening. Yeah, and we did have an element of that in Spain with Iberia, where the Spanish government expressed opinions. But as I told people, when I ran Aer Lingus, it was owned by the Irish government. I never listened to the opinion of any of the politicians there, because they're not driven by commercial reality. They're driven by a political reality, and political reality is they have to get re-elected. And to get re-elected, you've got to be popular. And to be popular, you do things that are not necessarily going to work in a commercial world. So, we faced some challenges at Iberia. But if you look at that company today, it's fundamentally a different company. Luis Gallego, who's the CEO there, has done a fantastic job. But the brand is better than it's ever been. The customer satisfaction is the highest it's ever been. It's more profitable. It's got, much better outlook in terms of its ability to compete globally, and it's recaptured all of the ground that we were forced to give up because we were inefficient, and it's expanded beyond that. Now, there are still a lot of challenges, but it just shows what you can do, if you restructure and become more competitive, and particularly when you're faced with competition, that is arrogant. And no disrespect to Air France, but, I was asked, I spoke at a conference in New York shortly after we announced the first stage of restructuring at Iberia, and the speaker before me was from Air France, and he was talking about this was going to be a great opportunity for them to expand their network, that they were going to fill the gap that we had left on the South Atlantic. And I was asked, by one of the speakers, was I not concerned about this? And my view was, going into this restructuring, I had a better cost base than Air France. I knew how much money I was losing flying these routes. Without question, Air France was going to lose a fortune trying to fill the gap that I had left. So my view was, take it. Lose more money, make yourself weaker, because I'll come back restructured and I'm going to take it back off you. And that's exactly what we've done.
Do you think there's ever a chance that it could blow apart Air France KLM-wise, and that the deal, which you could say perhaps should have been done in the past, a BA KLM deal, might come back your way in some way? Or is it
I make no secret of the fact that, I wasn't in BA at the time, but looking at it, I thought, BA and KLM should have joined. I think that would have been a powerful merger. Now, I question whether the attitude and the culture was right in BA in particular at the time to make it work. I think it was in KLM. I think to their credit, KLM has always had very strong leadership. And I think, certainly would have worked on their side. Maybe wouldn't have worked at BA. But yes, it's a deal that I think would look good. But KLM's a different animal now. It has suffered through lack of investment as being part of Air France KLM. Its cost base is not as efficient as it would be had it been run by an independent KLM management team, who I think are some of the best in the world. So it's a good airline. It's got a great hub. It's got a great network. But it's got a lot of challenges. So, we'll wait and see what happens. Okay.
And Tim, oil price, has that really been a mixed blessing, double-edged, I don't know, even triple-edged sword this year? Cost savings galore, but giving it all away in lower prices, or indeed precious oil markets for both of you, not flying in the premium cabins as well.
Well, that's absolutely right. The first thing, of course, there is the diminished segments in the premium cabins, driven by the oil and natural gas markets and the supply chain into that. We've also seen a disappearance of the, not a disappearance, a reduction in the financial services community. So we've had to change out the way we go about the segmentation of our premium cabins. Oil, of course, yes, it has had that effect. Of course, it's had a stellar effect in many respects on the bottom line, but taken together with the yield dilution, which has taken place, is along the lines we talked about earlier. And for us, because we are a dollar-based company, we've had the strength of the dollar working against us. So where we benefited from the oil price reduction in terms of seat mile costs and trip costs, we've had to deal with this very strong dollar and the change out of the nature of the business in terms of who's traveling, where they're traveling, why they're traveling, and trying to exploit and explore further those segments that still come to the market which are new to us or are growing at a greater pace than perhaps they might have done in the past. That's why things are quite interesting at the moment, but we'll see.
But you can keep moving aircraft around, I guess, more effectively than you ever could in the past because of the power of the hub and your exposure to the diversity of global markets in all the continents.
Yes, we have to keep an eye on what is the ebb and flow of demand, and that if you're heavily into Africa, as we are, with 22 cities on the continent, and watched how things have changed in terms of economics, in terms of the politics of the continent, we've had to make adjustments there. And equally, South America, as I said earlier. So you're constantly looking at, whereas we had a degree of equilibrium prior to the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, since then it's been quite an interesting challenge to match demand and capacity to extract the value you need to get the returns on the capital that you're employing. But so far so good, except this year more difficult, and we'll see what happens in 17 and 18.
Does that match your experience, Willie, in IAG?
Yeah, you know, we've seen oil and gas as a customer segment decline significantly. You know, we have seen the impact of financial services, but there have been some bright spots as well. But you know, the truth is, you know, we've got to be more flexible anyway. We've got to be able to move our capacity around. You know, it's not very sensible to be heavily dependent on one segment. People are often concerned about BA in particular because of what is a perceived reliance on financial services. And we pointed out recently that if you look at IAG, financial services, corporate travel, as a segment of our revenue base, is about 3% of our total revenue. Now that's significant, but it's much smaller than people imagined, you know, given the BA network in particular. So, you know, we've had to adjust. We've had to adjust our network, and we've had to become more competitive with our cost base.
And what about in the context, especially initially talking to you, the IAG agenda, the bigger political issues? I think there was a separate session going on this afternoon here about Brexit. I mean, you're right in the heart of what is going on and may go on. As Tim alluded, we have an interesting day on Wednesday. North Atlantic market, UK market. How can you plan scenarios or work through a process which is so unknown at the moment?
Yeah, you know, it's difficult, but you've just got to keep working and keep plugging away. And, you know, the reality is people are still flying, and people will continue to fly after the UK leaves Europe. And, you know, the travel patterns may change, but, you know, you'll still have people flying from the UK to the rest of the world, and you'll still have people from the rest of the world flying to the UK. The question is, you know, will that change radically from what we see today? I think it will change to some degree. You know, the financial services industry will probably feel some pain as a result of the UK leaving the EU. But the economy will be innovative. It'll find new ways of generating work and generating employment and value. And people will still fly. People have to fly. So we've just got to make sure that we're flexible enough to be able to change the network if the network needs to be adapted. But you've seen recently, we've announced more destinations in North America because we believe that's a market that will continue to grow. And our experience to date has been, you know, very encouraging. San Jose, California has been great. We've announced New Orleans. You know, I think that's going to be exciting as well. And Aer Lingus has been expanding its network from Ireland. It's now the only airline providing transatlantic capacity out of Hartford, Connecticut. So there's plenty of opportunity still to, develop and grow business between two established economies. Never mind trying to develop networks and businesses between establishing markets and the established.
And have you factored in some crystal ball sort of way that, you know, if one of the particular candidates gets in tomorrow, who's talking about putting walls up to neighbouring countries, tariff barriers against others, do you think we might see open skies torn up regardless of whether the UK is...
I don't think so. No, I don't think so, because ultimately politicians want to see employment, want to see the economy grow. I can't see how you're going to grow the economy and grow employment. And he's talked about being the best president for jobs creation ever. You know, you're not going to do that with a closed economy. So I'm not overly concerned. And if you look at it, you know, people assume that the U.S. economy does better under a Republican president. Interestingly, the statistics show that it actually does better under a Democrat president. So let's wait and see. I'm going to be in Washington tomorrow. I hadn't. It's interesting, when I planned to go to Washington, I didn't think it was going to be as exciting a day, but I'm going to be in Washington tomorrow, and I'm speaking at an event in Washington on Wednesday, so I may be tearing up my script starting again on Wednesday morning.
And how about you, Tim? I mean, you've had a few issues with the US anyway, regardless of political regime. What's your take? You mentioned about these fortresses growing up.
Well, I don't think that's a result of the Trump campaign or whatever. It's just the way the world is moving at the moment. You've seen what's happened in Europe. Of course, Brexit is probably a result of that, more than people being concerned about being part of Europe or not being part of it. So if either of these candidates get in, my own view is that it would be folly to tamper with something that has been very good for the United States, and that is open skies. As far as if Mr. Trump was to get in, then of course you've got all the checks and balances through Congress, through the Senate, through the judiciary. So I think a lot of it is going to be bluster, and then I think there'll be a degree of moderation kicking in, hopefully. If the other side get in, then I think it'll be more of the same. I think there will be a number of entities still banging the drum about the presence of the Gulf carriers and how they're deconstructing the way the American airlines go about their huge profitability, and it's a challenge to that, and we can talk about that till the cows come home. I hope the sense will prevail. I am concerned that if you do get this, as I said earlier, this move towards a deliberalization, not just in aeropolitics, but in global trade, and you've heard what he's been saying about some of these protocols that have been the trade protocols that the US has in place or wants to put in place. Those are more of a worry because they have a contagious effect across the planet. What the US tends to do, others will follow. And it may accelerate what is going on in Europe. So we've got to be very careful now as an international carrier, and there are a number of us in that area. BA, of course, is in that as well, where we trade freely and in an unencumbered manner and successfully as a result of what has happened since the early 90s. And that's probably been the best thing, irrespective of financial crash, irrespective of the ups and downs we've had. This is the only way the planet can actually move ahead. It's not just about economics, it's also about sort of cultural meshes, the understanding of how we all go about our lives, and splicing those, if you like, to make sure that creates demand for travel, that creates demand for international travel in a way that they've never had before. It would be sad if we had a political movement, if I can use that word, on either side of both sides of the Atlantic, which seems to constrain that. How we deal with the EU and how we deal with the US as far as what they call the Gulf carrier syndrome is almost another story. We will continue to do that whichever way it goes.
Just to jump in there, Tim, I mean, I'm not sure that all the audience will be aware, but there was a big complaint levelled at the three Gulf carriers, yourselves, Etihad and Qatar, last year by Delta, United and American. They put out, I think it was a 50-page report and some supporting evidence. You fired back a rebuttal, which I think ran to a few hundred pages, as did Qatar and Etihad. Has that gone away, or could it come back again as a function of politics?
Well, you have to judge on the success of what they started. Have they been successful? No. We've now got 10 or 11 points in the US. We've opened Orlando last year. We're opening Fort Lauderdale next month. We've increased our production, both in terms of frequencies and gauge. We're putting a lot of 380s into the US. So as far as Emirates is concerned, the campaign that they started the year before last has actually failed completely. Has it resonated with some of the players in the Washington administration? Yes, it has, but I don't honestly believe that they were minded to destabilize what is a very good open skies arrangement that certainly the United Arab Emirates and Qatar has with the US, because it then started to cause you to look at what they were doing with China. It's a bit strange that, for instance, American Airlines or Delta should be doing deals with Chinese carriers which are actually state-owned, on the one hand, and then complain that some of the carriers that they're dealing with in the Gulf states are state-owned and ergo subsidized and everything else. So there is a kind of mismatch of thought with regard to how they go about this. I don't think that's been lost on state and commerce and transport, the three primary entities in Washington that are dealing with it. There is a very large groundswell of support for the Gulf carriers present in the markets of the US for obvious reasons: job creation, wealth creation, tourism, and look at the deals that we've done for Boeing and General Electric. So taken together, this is not so smart. At a time when the American carriers have been making such phenomenal profits. They've never had it so good, and so even that is something that those three entities will be questioning as to why they are so concerned about us coming in, adding value. After all, most of the points that we serve on the Emirates network in the Middle East, African and West Asian regions, they don't serve. They never have done. And if they have, they've gone in and left. So we're actually bringing business from all those countries and all those cities into US cities and adding value to everything they do. So the value added proposition, which is we have measured to the fourth decimal place, hence the 500-page rebuttal, where we set to and examined all of this, and where we could actually say, look, guys, if you do want to upset this, if you do want to diminish what is a very good relationship, you will be the loser primarily. And of course, that resonated well with all the entities I spoke about. And many, many cities in the US have asked us to come and fly there. And I could rattle off 10 or 15 straight away. I won't, but they are extremely keen. And I'm sure that Akbar and James Hogan in Etihad gets the same approach. Will you come and open our cities so that we can have the benefit of the African, Middle Eastern and West Asian regions, and to a lesser extent even places like Thailand. So we'll see.
Time's moving too quick, but Willie, just briefly, I mean, you've been supportive of what Tim was describing there. Does it give you any sensitivities, again, in terms of your joint business or One World? American is one of these three protagonists.
None whatsoever. And to me, it's a principled issue. So you either believe in free, liberal, open skies, or you don't, and you can't pick and choose. So, you know, I firmly believe that open skies, and even a more liberal open skies arrangement, is the way forward. So, given that that is the case, you know, I've been very clear that, you know, we don't support the view expressed by the US carriers, and, you know, we have openly criticized some of the data that they've used, which we have said is untrue. So, you know, they have quoted data that they attribute to us or our business. It's not correct. So from that point of view, you know, we dismiss the document that was produced by the US carriers, and it's on a point of principle, you know. And to me, you either stand by these principles, and it's the same with Norwegian. You know, do I like what they're doing? Well, you know, it's making life tougher for me, but do I believe he's doing anything wrong? Absolutely not. And if he has found a way of, you know, operating within the framework, well, then he should be allowed to operate within the framework. And people who try and argue that the framework should be reconstructed to stop these people, I just don't buy into that.
I think this topic you'll both be happy to talk about, unless I'm badly mistaken. Aircraft. Tim, you know, I think it's fair to say you've had a lot of influence over the years in shaping the type of aircraft which are available to the world's airlines, with particularly today's workhorse for Boeing 777, especially 300 ER version. And of course, Airbus's A380, which you're the primary customer, and arguably Airbus would be in a much worse place with that aircraft today if you didn't have the big orders in. You want Airbus to take the next step with that aircraft. Do you still have some optimistic hopes they will, or do you think at the moment you're trying to push water up a hill to re-engine that and up-spec it?
At the moment, I'm not sure there is the appetite there in Toulouse, to be quite honest. They struggle to find a business case that is compelling. I have been fairly vocal about their ability to sell this aeroplane to the airlines that I think should be using it and will need to use it, given that one of the biggest constraints that the airline industry faces will be the capacity of the hubs and the airports to grow at the pace that global demand, once it gets through this rough patch, will be. So if you're talking 6 or 7 billion people moving by air in 2013, here we are in 2016, coming up to 2017 with 3.5 billion, you've got 2.5 billion extra people who want to travel. That can't all be on low cost to second and third level fields. So the hubs are going to come under enormous pressure. And no doubt you'll be talking about the third runway at Heathrow. But then if you look at Sydney, you look at New York, you look at Los Angeles, you look at Hong Kong with its relatively new airport, now they're going to have to build a third runway, etc. So the answer to me, to meet these, even if you extrapolate at 3 or 4%, you'll get to a stage where you'll need a 500-seater to occupy slots that are becoming increasingly more expensive and precious in terms of their opportunity cost. Now that kind of is lost at the moment because of all the things we've talked about in the last 40 minutes about the way things are at the moment. You have a high degree of risk aversity in the boards of the airlines today. You know, I've seen since the financial crash a transition from the sort of entrepreneurial spirit that I used to think was driving the industry forward, and no disrespect to the accounting or legal profession, but the boards have gone into safe hands. Now, of course, Willie is not one of those, and I think what you see in the IAG group is a group that has the commercial and business acumen to take it through. And when we talked about Iberia and all the concerns that people had, what he did was actually transform something into something which has become the IAG of today, which is quite spectacular. But we need more of those. If the 380 is going to survive, it needs people on the board who've got the vision to say, look, demand is going to continue. We have primary city pairs which are becoming overloaded in terms of demand. We're not having enough capacity. The trick is to upgrade. So if you've got a 150-seater slot being taken by X carrier at such and such an airport where you could put a 500-seater, the logic is good for the airports, it's good for the economy, it's also good for the airlines, but they've got to step up and do it. At the moment, they won't. And however hard Mr. Lee and his boys are trying in Toulouse, it's not really working. I mean, I think I try very hard to argue to all my competitors, if you want to challenge us, go and buy the 380. It's the best thing for you to do. But seriously, when you look at the constraints we're all facing in this business over the next 5 or 10 years, it has to be that. After all, the third runway at Heathrow, let's assume it gets built, is 2026, if you're lucky. That's 10 years out. What are we going to do in the next 10 years at Heathrow? And as I said, if you try and get a slot in JFK, very difficult. Equally, Los Angeles or Boston or wherever you go, Sydney is another one. So the 380 for me is the answer, but I can't persuade the likes of the airlines.
Willie, could you take a few more off Airbus's hands? You've got some options, but I think you're not happy about the price.
Yeah, no, we like the aircraft. We have 12. It works very well. Tim is right. You know, there is this issue of how much risk are you prepared to take? The aircraft works extremely well on parts of our network. We don't believe it will work equally well right across the network. I've been very open. We could make a case for a couple of A380s in Iberia. I think I could make a pretty good case for an A380 in Aer Lingus. You wouldn't operate an airline with one or two, but with a group you can do that. Yeah. So, if the price was right, we're prepared to look at more A380s. We like the aircraft, our customers love the aircraft, and it works extremely well.
But the ones you have an option at the moment, Airbus is expecting too much in terms of a price.
We all negotiate, and I think Airbus would be surprised if I said that they offer aircraft at great prices. I think they offer great aircraft. Terrible, really expensive prices.
I don't know if anybody from Airbus is in the audience. But of course, there's going to be second-hand 380s coming on the market. Yeah. I mean, ultimately with yourselves, Tim, I think Singapore, I saw, may not renew leases. Malaysian would like to divest of their entire fleet. So maybe Airbus should be watching that. Conscious again of time moving on, you both mentioned runways, or you in particular, Tim. Third runway at Heathrow, we got a government green light a couple of weeks ago.
Not quite. You've got a government indicating a preference for one of the runways, one of the plans at Heathrow. But what they've been very good, and I have to admire them for this, is they've said it's conditional on various issues. And one of the key issues it's conditional on is the airport being able to develop that runway without increasing passenger charges. And that's been the the case that we've argued for. The days of airports just building expensive, inefficient infrastructure and passing the cost on to airlines and our customers, those days are over. We're not going to tolerate it anymore. We've been absolutely clear in relation to that. I think the economic case for the expansion of Heathrow is very strong, but there is no way anyone on this world can justify spending the 17.6 billion that has been identified in the manner in which it was going to be spent. Absolutely no way. That would have been an outrageous waste of money, and the people taking the risk were the airlines and the airline customers rather than the shareholders. So I think the government and what the CAA has done in writing to the airport about how it's done is absolutely critical. And I point to things in it. I've gone through, and I'm sure everybody has, the details of that 17.6 billion. 1% is for the runway. So the bit that we're all interested in is 1% of the cost. 800 million has been earmarked for a car park. And as I said, you can go online, and I encourage everyone to do it because it's great fun, and Google how much does it cost to build a multi-story car park, and you'll get it. It'll tell you, average price per space. This is a great thing about the internet. I've found price ranging from 10 to 17,000 pounds per space. So if you take the highest end, 17 grand, divide 17 into 800 million and you get 47,000. There is no way on this earth they're building a 47,000 space car park at Heathrow. So where's it going? Where's the money? Now they'll say, oh, well, some of that is for roads. I don't care. You cannot get to 800 million. You just can't get there. Unless, of course, you're inefficient and you don't care how much money you spend, because all of that money then goes into the regulated asset base and you're getting rewarded based on the amount of money you've put into that asset base. That model doesn't work in a commercial world, and I'm pleased that the government have recognised that.
You said that the regulator, for those who are not from the UK, the Civil Aviation Authority, the chief exec, has written a letter which has been publicly made available to the chief exec of the airport. This seems to me is a global issue. There's always this challenge between airports and airlines, sometimes a gulf of understanding. Would you be optimistic, at least due to that intervention, that there will be some sense of people sitting down around the table and talking it through in an adult way so that you get what you need to run your business and the airport can build a runway?
Yeah, absolutely. I've no objection to Heathrow expanding. I think that will be good. I've no objection to Gatwick expanding. I do object to having to pay for it, unless what they're building is what we need, and unless what they're building is built in an efficient manner. I have a huge objection to the idea that you can build anything at any price in the name of the national economy and expect others to pick up the tab for it. We deliberately stood back from this process because I was concerned that if we were to come out and favour one or the other, the argument would be that, well, you guys asked for it, now you should pay for it. What I've been very clear about is we didn't ask for it, and therefore we're not prepared to pay for it. We are prepared to pay for the efficient development of infrastructure that will benefit the economy, but we're not going to pay for inefficient expansion of the airport. And let's be honest, T5 is fantastic, but boy, was it expensive. And if you were building it, if Tim was building it, if I was building it, you would not spend the sort of money that Heathrow has spent in the past. But the regulatory environment has incentivized the airports to build expensive infrastructure because that's how they get rewarded.
Tim, do you share those views? What's your relationship like with Dubai? I mean, a lot of infrastructure built to your specification, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. But to Willie's point, the notion that the airports have had for so many decades that if they're going to expand, they extract the cost of the expansion out of the existing client base, the passengers, etc. That is fundamentally flawed as far as I'm concerned. What they should be doing is looking at the capital costs of what they're going to be doing, seeing whether they can create in the debt markets the money to be able to support that, and monetizing the cash flows once it comes online to see whether they're going to get the returns through the aeronautical fees, the merchandising, fast food, whatever that goes on in an airport. After all, Heathrow, by that time, will have 120, 130 million people going through it. And if you can't extract value from the client base, probably the passengers going through it, post its completion, then you really shouldn't be in the business in the first place, in my view. So as Willie says, if you gild the lily with regard to the construction of what you're trying to do and the costs associated with that, the whole thing gets fundamentally challenged if they say, no, you will not go after the existing client base and the passengers within the airlines today. That'll cause them to rethink, and I guarantee you, if they do that, and they bring in some value engineering into what they're actually doing, that cost of 17 billion will fall by half. That's where it should be, in my view. Now, in the case of Dubai, we have very recently introduced passenger charges, but it's nothing to do with the cost of construction. I'm pleased to say that a large amount of our dividends that we give the government, contrary to what the American Airlines say, goes into the increase in the capacity of the existing airport, and how they raise the funds, and they're just about to float a bond in Dubai to fund the first stage of the new airport down in Jebel Ali, a $3 billion bond. That'll be predicated on the ability for the, as I said, the cash flows to be met in the construction phase, and then monetizing everything else that comes in later. That's the way that everybody has to do it. After all, we have to do that. When we buy aeroplanes and we're spending $400 million, well, I say that in case Airbus is listening, for a 380. And we have 85 of those, and I don't start in the bill process go after the passengers and say you've got to contribute to the cost of these airplanes coming down the line. After all, if that was the case, we'd be out of business very quickly. So somehow that think has got to change. It's not just the United Kingdom. A lot of countries in the world where they have privatized the airports, the airports should be made to go about their business in an arm's length manner and make sure that they do not overcook the whole situation. As Willie says, a 47,000 space car park. I know they've got to build over the M4. I know they've got work to do there. But wow, 17 billion. I think we are building DWC, which is a 5-runway, 180 million, 200 million for something like $30 billion. So let's put it in pounds today, which is about £3, isn't it, the strength of the dollar. But let's say it's about 20 billion. So 20 billion pounds to build that thing, and 17 billion to build a single runway with I mean, I'm probably being pounced upon by my friends in Heathrow, but it does seem to be an awful lot of money, I have to say.
Gentlemen, we're very nearly out of time, regrettably. I've got to ask you a couple of more questions. But one thing, we are here at WTM, major players from around the world here on behalf of tourism. Any key messages either of you would like to give in terms of the role that governments play, the role that tourism partners play in terms of facilitating aviation as part of the tourism recipe today? Willie?
Well, it's you need to remember the economic value created through aviation and through tourism, and it's never been more evident than since the vote to leave the EU. It's been very clear that in that environment we're going to have to do things in a different way. And as I said at the beginning, I'm a great admirer of the Gulf governments, because they've been able to see the value that aviation can contribute to their economy, and they invested in that many years ago, and they're now seeing how that has transformed their economies. And look at the Gulf today; it's unrecognizable to where it was 30 years ago when Tim had started at Emirates. So there's huge value to be created, employment to be created. It is a fantastic industry, but it does need facilitation by government.
Different approach about taxes at all?
Yeah, like air passenger duty is crazy. I'm not even going to mention why, because everybody knows in this room. Everybody knows it's crazy. See? Everyone agrees.
Tim?
Well, tourism and hospitality, if anything that has come through all the troubles, the tribulations that the global economy's had over the last 30, 40 years, it's been this very strong, shining light in virtually all economies, is the growth of tourism, the way that the entities, the NGOs, the commercial entities have transformed tourism. It gets back to the point I made about shutting down and going back to the sort of predeterminist thinking. Global tourism, if you look back over the 30 years, has been extraordinary. It's brought multiple segments to the business, not just in the airline business, but to everywhere else. People are traveling, they're mixing business with pleasure. You see the way, as mentioned earlier, as the digital transformation takes place, so the B2C world just explodes. People are making their own decisions. They have a Pandora's box of choice. The hospitality trade, the tourism trade have really, really opened themselves up to access online, and that is just creating a Pandora's box of choice. And it is that thing that, for me, one of the segments that has always been strong for us is tourism. And when I look back in the early, well, I should say the late 80s, and I was trying to identify what would happen on the sort of the global stage over the next 10 or 15 years, tourism kept on coming through to me as something that would grow. It's something that is ubiquitous in its reach, whichever budget level you're at, high end, mid, or very low. And it's vital to the global economy. And the metrics tell us that time and time again. So shows like this, where there's a gathering of the great and the good. But importantly, these days, as I go back to this B2C world we're moving into, you've got a lot of ideas being discussed, assimilated in places like this, or ITB in Berlin, some of the big players, but multiple other shows where people are learning how to enhance all of that. For the airline business, that's great. When I see everything else going south in many ways, tourism is vital.
I'm just going to take a risk and get one or two quick questions. If there's anyone wants to ask a very quick question, gentleman here and lady there, you two can move it too. You can just get your questions in. Hopefully we've covered a lot of stuff that you wanted to hear. So this gentleman straight in front of me, can we just get a mic to him? Have we got a mic handy? This one straight in front of me will be a very quick one, please.
Okay, this is Andreas Scholz of Travel and Tourism, addressed to Sir Tim. You mentioned to keep your mighty A380 fleet busy. Is this a friendly act of competition to fly into Doha? And is your colleague Al Akbar Hawis reacting on this?
Well, we put the 380 on a particularly strong time channel, where the demand on that particular time channel, we've got 5 or 6 a day, or more, I think it's 9. We decide that we'll try out and see what the 380 does there. It's a very competitive route. Akbar, Qatar Airways has, I think, 20 flights a day there, and Fly Dubai, etc. So we'll see. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, it's not unusual. We've used large wide-body aircraft on short routes where you have the aircraft available. Sometimes it can make sense to do that. You wouldn't buy it to fly between Dubai and Doha, but if you have it available, why not use it?
Yeah.
Okay, this lady here. Got no mic sound.
Can you?
Yeah.
You touched on this earlier with regard to low-cost airlines, particularly with Norwegian. I'm from Canada, and certainly we have added baggage and that sort of thing. However, whenever I travel in Europe, it's almost to a point of nickel and diming, where on one flight, I asked for a second glass of water and I was told you have to pay for that. And I guess my question to you is, for the non-low-cost airlines, how far is this nickeling and diming going to continue to go on and on? Because at the end of the day, if you add exactly what you're paying for when you get off that airplane, it's probably the same as a general carrier, with inclusive of the luggage, of, a juice on board, or that sort of thing.
I'm just going to paraphrase the question just in the interest of time. So really, is there a change in product approach? Is it all becoming aligned like the
low-cost model? Is it all going to become this nickeling and diming and pay?
Woody, do you want to lead quickly on that?
I don't think it is nickel and diming, but I think it is down to choice. And, you still have choices. You can choose an airline that gives you everything in the ticket price, or you can choose an airline that unbundles it. And the reality of it is, I talked about this in my previous life. I've never met anybody who chooses to fly because of the food we give them. I've never met anybody who said, I'm going to fly between Dublin and London because you give me a meal. They fly between Dublin and London because they have to, or because they want to. They don't do it for the food. Now, will they do it without food? The evidence clearly shows absolutely they will. Now, if you give them the food, will they take it? Yes. If you give them crap food, will they eat it? No, they won't. You end up throwing it out at the end of the flight. So it is down to choice. And choice changes with consumers, and it changes over time. And what people are accepting as the acceptable level of service today is very different to what it was when I started in this industry nearly 40 years ago. And I think it will change going forward. And we may see some things come full circle. But, the way we look at it is, there are choices available, and if you don't want certain parts of the product, you don't have to pay for it. Where consumers object is where you present it as being a choice, but in fact you don't have a choice, where you're forced to pay for something extra.
I'll let Tim come back to you because we've got no mic and we haven't got time either. So Tim, you're making some product changes according to price and so on.
You know, you're seeing the price points, particularly in the economy segments. We've seen it in the low cost. Now you're seeing the pricing points coming down quite rapidly on the long haul network carriers, and it is clear that if your reference point is quite low, and you want to keep it that way, then you don't have to take on all these other bits and pieces. You don't have to pay for the bag. You don't have to pay for your meal. You don't have to, well, Mr. O'Leary's not here, use the toilet or the hat rack or whatever. The fact of the matter is, the unbundling approach is not just peculiar to what we're doing in the airline business, it's going on everywhere. So if you look at the way Amazon.com goes about its business, way automotive is going about its business, so there are lower reference prices to which you can build if you want to. Some people don't want to do that. So yes, paying for a second glass of water, but goodness me, on the low cost today, they'll sell small bottles of water, and if you want another one, you'll pay for it, etc. And there's a balance here. So you don't want to go to the extreme, but I think there are also other things that you can do within the economy segments that can bundle up new products which are attractive to people and it's clear that, again, going back to this highly B2C environment we're in now, that people will be prepared to pay that little bit extra. You might want, I think BA led this recently, or the last couple of years, where they presented a different type of meal. So if you want to spend something other than what they're serving as the economy offering, then that comes at a price. So there's a lot more we can do as an industry to get a balance between what we are charging and how much more we'd like to get to the returns on investment that we need. And it does not mean that economy passengers, particularly, are being subjected to a situation where they are starved of food and made to pay for everything. I think there's a balance there, and I think that is definitely what's coming. When I made a reference to an inflection point, I think that is starting to morph its way through into businesses like ours, and I have introduced seat selection charges on a choice basis. It's not mandatory. If you don't want to book the seat in advance and pay for it, then 48 hours before we're open for check-in, take your chance. But if you do want to have extra baggage, we already have an excess baggage regime. We've always had that, but we had daft prices like 1% per kilo of the first class fare, which made absolutely no sense. That's a total rip-off. So we need to bundle that, package up exactly what is it that you want, how are you going to pay for it, and make it a reasonable proposition. That's coming. So I would be fairly relaxed about that.
I stayed in a 5-star hotel recently, paid for it with my own money, and the price of the Mars bar and it was a small Mars bar, £7. A bottle of water was £7. Now, you know, you tell me if I could charge £7 for a Mars bar, you know, would I do it? You're damn right I would. Would anybody buy it? I can't believe they would. Yeah, and I certainly didn't eat a £7 Mars bar. I was wondering, was it different to the ordinary Mars bar that I would get? And I'm not going back to the hotel to try it, but you know, we'll see where we end up.
Well, on that note, sadly, we're out of time on the topic of Mars bars. Willie Walsh, Chief Executive of IAG, Sir Tim Clark, President of Emirates Airline. Thank you both very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you too.